Let Dave get going. Thanks everybody for coming. Y'all got a handout on the back. Shows some upcoming events that he'll be doing here, as well as you might want to take note on September 13th. They have a fundraiser and dinner. Looks inviting. So thanks for coming. There's extra water. Feel free to help yourself and enjoy Mr. Schleper's Writers in Early Shakopee. Thank you all.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we've already met before, most of you anyway. Again, I grew up in Shakti starting in 1962 when I was 2 years old. My family moved here. I grew up on Main and 7th Street on the corner. And with my parents, and at that time there were 5 children. There ended up being 8 children. And when I graduated from high school, I was an exchange student to Australia. And when I came back from that, I ended up going to living in Colorado, Washington, D.C., Honolulu, Hawaii. And eventually, all around, not too long ago, a few years ago, I moved back here because my mom at that time had Alzheimer's and I wanted to be around to help with that. So today, each time I come, I speak on a different topic. As you can see in the back, there'll be others coming. But this one's just about writers in early Shakopee, and it's interesting because there were a lot of people who wrote a lot back then. Probably, of course, they didn't have internet, they didn't have, all the things that people do now, but a lot of people did write, especially they wrote letters, they did diaries, they did presentations where they had everything written down. So this starting to, this is Daniel Storer there, but in the back is interesting. That's actually downtown Shakopee, which now is probably where the highway went through to the bridge there, but this is probably the what the old opera house area was at that time, but this was a while before. So we're going to start. I actually list some people that I pick out just to get some examples of this because I think they're just kind of interesting ones. And the first one is Sarah Irene Faribault, and I bring up her because she's tied into the Faribault family, the one that actually moved here to Shakopee in 1844. The family, like Sarah, is part Dakota Indian, part Canadian French, a kind of mixture of both. They spoke English. They also spoke Dakota because her mother spoke just Dakota. And they also spoke French. They actually did more French and Dakota than they did English, actually, believe it or not. And she's actually buried here at Valley Cemetery. What's interesting about her is she never got married, and she's actually buried not with the other Faribaults, but with somebody else, because she became a nurse, and she ended up working with families for a long time, and she ended up being in their cemetery, so just interesting. Okay, so Sarah Irene was one of 4 girls that actually lived at the Faribault Cabin, which is now in the landing in Shakopee. At that time, this area, it wasn't called Shakopee yet, it was called Prairie de France, or the French Prairie, on the St. Peter River, which of course was the Minnesota River. And Sarah was the 7th of 9 children of Oliver Faribault and Wakanyanki. Okay. Wakanyanki actually means the woman who sits at the high place. And that's the location, if you look downtown Dangerfield, right across from there is where they lived. Now that cabin, which was from 1844, was moved to the landing in 1969, and it's there still. Okay. They just actually are fixing it up, I believe. And she, like a lot of people, they wrote, especially in 1914, they realized that all these people who were here when they started into Minnesota, mostly white people, but some people who were Dakota or part Dakota, and they realized that they were going to be gone soon. They were dying out. And they wanted to write down what is the information they have, something interesting. And so she was one who, in this book, and the book I think is out here somewhere, someone can pull up, yeah. So in there she actually writes, and then they tell her the information, she wrote it down, and then they did it for several other people too, okay? And here's what she said. She said, my father, Oliver Faribault, built a house which was his home and a trading post near Little Six, or Shakopee's village, in 1844. It was a fine point for a trading post because there were 3 Indian villages in the area. There was Good Roads, Black Dogs, and Shakopee. Shakopee, remember, was at this area. Right over that same area was where what used to be called Tinta Otanwa, or the village on the prairie. And she says he was a very successful trader, and she remembers the great bags or things of fur that she brought. She also said, and this is another thing that I thought was interesting, she said, we used to play ball all the time in the country near. I could shoot an arrow as well as a boy. The hunting was fine. So it's just kind of an interesting thing, yes.
Where was that Native American community that used to have something?
Tinta Otanwa is there were 600 people who lived here before the white people arrived here, actually. They started probably in about 1690. It was on the north side of the river until about 1839. Then it moved on the south side of the river. It was in a couple different places, but it's basically, you know, where Memorial Park is, downtown, Dangerfields, that area. That's all the area that used to be part. It actually started on Somerville Street, what is now Somerville Street, and goes all the way to right beyond the warehouse for Amazon. That area was where they lived.
Was Black Dog up where
That was further.
Where the power plant is?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
then where was Good?
Good was further more closer to where now is Southbridge area. In that area. Southbridge, which is where Walmart. I'm trying to think of a good victory. Walmart area.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, up there.
Yeah. Okay.
Guess I've never heard of that.
Yeah, you don't hear as much about either of those. The biggest one, and the one that's most there's most documentation, is Tinta Otanwa, because that was right here.
Okay.
What later became Shakopee. And it's also interesting because she talks about, she said, we often went to the sacred stone of the Indians. There was a stone, it's not there anymore, but anyway, and we'd see that the Sioux warriors were around it. It was in the prairie below town. They actually believe it's on the other side of the river, what is now Eden Prairie area, okay? And there was room for one to lie down on it and rest, and they would dance or sit in a council around it. They always went in there before they went into battle. And then they used to would leave gifts that the white people would take. I can remember taking some little things from it myself. I passed a party of Indians with it in my hand, so she had something, right? And she remembered that one Dakota woman said she became very angry, and she made me take it back. She seemed to feel as if if it was our church had been violated. So it's just interesting what memories that she has that she wrote back though. But again, Sarah never married, She lived with a family, then she resided with one family in Henderson, Minnesota, and then St. Paul for almost 22 years. And she also, the D.L. Howe family, she lived with that family for a long time. And their location was what is now, what used to be City Hall, that's now torn down downtown on Home Street. Used to be the First National Bank before that. Before that it was the American Legion. Before that it was the first hospital in Shakopee. And before that was where Howe lived with them. So, okay. And she died in 1924. She was 74 years old. And again, she was buried with the Howe family. So it's just kind of interesting. We don't really know. To me, it's kind of like, well, why? They did have a plot there. I do know that because Howe's wife, they ended up, they were quite a fight between the two, and she ended up not living or being buried there anyway. So there was a plot, I suppose, and it's probably free, is my guess. Okay. And Samuel Pond is also one who there's. He was in Prairieville, which they called Tintotanwa. The translation of that would be Prairieville, or then became Sakpe or Shakopee. Okay, and it's interesting because Samuel Pond was really important for the history of Minnesota and the Dakota, because he's the one who, when he first arrived in Minnesota, he and his brother, he went right away to people and asked, what is the word for horse? What is the word for whatever? And he would write it down. And he ended up having, I think, 3,000 words in Dakota, which then became the Dakota dictionary that then is still used today. So it's really was important. But before he retired, or actually after he retired, before he died on December 12th, 1891. He wrote about the Dakota culture and language because he had so much experiences. And they said it's so important because he really looked and made notes of every little thing that happened. He looked at what they were doing and he wrote it down. And he wrote it down. And he wrote it down. And it was only, because the Dakota Indian at that time were there, but they didn't write things down. They just passed it along. But he actually wrote it down, and so therefore we now have specific memories of 1839 in Minnesota. And so there's books, I think there's a couple books by him that's on this table too, I think. But anyway, it's just interesting. And here's an example talking about the corn that was corn was grown downtown Shakopee at that time, okay? And he was very specific. He'd say, the barrels were made by bending broad pieces of bark around like hoops that lapped the edge together, sewing them with bark. The bottom was made of a circular piece of bark sewed on, and when the barrel was full to the top, it was covered in the same manner. These bark barrels had from 2 to 5 bushels. See how very specific things he says, very like things that we wouldn't know unless someone had written it down like this. And then it was deposited in them, and then they buried them. And then once it was done, they would keep them dry and durable. And then when they were hungry, they were able to dig it out and use it. So it's just interesting, the very specific things that he did. And the other thing that he said, they said one time, I think this was in the fall of 1835, he was actually went with the Dakota when they went hunting. They went hunting, I think October, right? Yeah. He went for deer hunting. And they were out for like 1 month. And he just went with them. Okay. I'm sure his wife wasn't that thrilled. But anyway, actually I don't think they were married yet at this point. But anyway, he did similar things other time though. He'd often would go off, whatever, to what's going on. But he actually documented then what happened. And that's where he really learned some of the words, because they were using the words and he would write it down, every little words as they explained about the hunt. And he said, the language, however, was the game that I went to hunt. And I was as eager to pursue it as the Indians were of deer. And it's deer is actually D-E-E-R, by the way, but anyway. Sorry, that's bad smelling. But I do notice it later. That's a good thing. But anyway, I'll have to remember to change it. And this person who is a Dakota Indian, he said probably he knew more about the Dakota than any other white person in the mid-19th century. He spoke their languages more fluently, and he was an especially keen observer of Dakota's economy, social, and religious institutions. So it's really important that the Dakota themselves really really honor him a lot. And that's why, like now, for example, there is in the high school, the new high school, there is a statue of Pond and Chief Shakopee too. And you know, downtown they're going to put a new statue of Pond in downtown Shakopee. So why is that so important? Because he was very important for the whole state, but is also here in Shakopee. And there are, again, books that he wrote. This one about what their life was like in 1834, and then about the two volunteer missionaries, which was Samuel Pond and Gideon Pond. Okay. So again, so that's another interesting person who actually wrote down, especially when he retired, he wrote down some good stuff. Now, why is that important? Because you should be doing the same thing. Okay. We'll go on back to that later. But it is important. I say it over and over again. You know, and the same thing is like with my parents. You know, we sat and asked questions and wrote some things down. Boy, I would love to have another, you know, give me just an hour with them, you know, because they have so many interesting stories, and you really want to document that. And it's important to give the history to pass down of what life was like, because eventually people will forget it. And if we have it documented, it works well. There's a good history, for example, of Shakopee in the 1930s, where they actually interviewed people who then remembered from earlier. It's the same thing. So it's just important for you always to think, can I write some of this down or videotape it, somehow have it, and if you want any of those things, you can give them to us or give this to us, and we will make copies and return it. So we'll have that documentation for the future. All right. Now, remember that Samuel Pond and Cordelia, his wife, they had 4 children. The oldest child was Jeanette Clarissa Pond, and she had Diaries. Unfortunately, she ended up dying a little early. I think that's the right. I think she was 19 years old when she died. But before then, she writes. So if you go to the Minnesota Historical Society, I mean, I just basically go through and look at them, read them, and see what they have. It's interesting stories. Jeanette, they used to call her actually as Janet. So I'm going to call her Janet from now on, just remember that. But it's interesting because Janet is the one that Cordelia and Sam along with, was with the baby. She was 3 weeks old, and they were headed to the mission. And they told them the baby will not survive. I mean, she's only three weeks old. And so Samuel put a little box in the boat, which was used for a coffin if needed. So he was prepared, okay, in case she died, because it was about a 130-mile journey by boat. And according to Samuel Pond, that journey was one of the particular anxieties to the young mother, whose little baby faded day by day before her eyes. only those who had passed through a little experience which rested upon her in her inexperience and extremity. I don't know how to say it. Okay. She felt that she was watching this 3-week-old child basically die, and she's right there. Okay. But she survived. And she ended up being really a good child. And she writes quite well. I was quite surprised, actually. So again, she was known as Janet. She was the oldest child. And she wrote diaries from age 8 until 14 years old. And she dies, I'll tell you how she dies in a little bit, I think. But anyway. So here's her writing, you know. And this is like, I think, some of the first ones, even very young, she was writing with cursive, which I just find very interesting. And here's an example of where this is in 1850. And she says, Mrs. Faribault, remember that was right across the river, the springs was the Faribault family. And the pond was one side and the Faribault was the other. And she writes, Mrs. Faribault, she spells Faribault wrong, but that's okay, came here and made a long visit. She brought all her children with her, and we had a fine play with them. Mrs. Faribault's oldest girl stayed here a while after the rest were gone. So it's just he's basically, she just document what's going on, but it's interesting to see how she does it. And then here on August 23rd, 1850, I hemmed the whole end of a sheet. She did hems, it was wrong, but that's spelled or this sort of thing, okay? Mother made some bread. An Indian brought us some plums, but we did not take them because they would make us sick. The Indians brought some hard nuts, but we did not take them too for the same purpose. It was too early in the season at that time for that kind. And here's a couple years later, she's writing, she says, Monday, a German man that lived out in the woods came here and said his wife was very sick. He brought a horse and took father's wagon, and father went with him. She was very sick. She had a little baby. So it's just an interesting documentation of what's going on at the time. It's just very interesting. And then it continues on the next 2 days later. She says, the Indian boys brought us a few strawberries, and we bought them with potatoes. So they kind of exchanged there. An Indian woman brought us some gooseberries. So it's just kind of interesting that that's basically what she wrote down. It's just a basic diary, I think probably just to be able to write. And it's just interesting, the kind of things. I would love to, my next goal eventually, I want to write down, take all of her diary and then type it up. I think it'd be a really interesting story. But she died, she was 19 years old of lung fever, which basically was pneumonia. And she's buried in Valley Cemetery here in Shakopee. Now here's another really interesting person, Florence. She ended up, when she ended up going, she's from Ohio. She eventually got to, I think, Washington State. But in the middle, for about 6 years, I think, she lived in Shakopee. Here, I think I have it here. Yeah, she lived from 1854 to 1860. And she said, this is one thing that she wrote in her book. She wrote, to illustrate what the winters were like, the thermometer froze up the 6 winters we lived here, with the exception of one. That was Minnesota, okay? And it's just interesting stories that she writes. So one time she talks about the rest of the party kept together and took up planes 9 miles south of Shakopee. So if you look at where would that be, okay, you know, with the Minnesota River, in other words, it's probably in Spring Hill, or Spring Lake, I should say. area, probably, okay? It was dense timber. Indians were as numerous as the squirrels. The Indians taught the boys how to fish by cutting a hole in the ice and gigging fish. So it's just a brand new idea, but that's what they were learning things, okay? And she said they would get necessary supplies at Shakopee as it was a trading post established by the fur company. Now, which trading post that was, whether it was probably Thomas Holmes trading post, but it could have been the Faribault trading post. Both of those were happening about at that time, okay? And they said there was a company of soldiers who came up on the boat with their folks, and they were stationed at Fort Snelling as protection to the settlers. And this is one of my favorite things that I wrote, I was reading through their whole story. She said, one time there was a short time in Minnesota, Baxter and Mary, which is your two sisters, sister and brother, decided they wanted to teach in English to speak English. He would say over after them in English after telling them in Sioux. He had played with them for an hour or longer when they ran and put their arms on Old Sorrel and said, horse. Okay. And the Dakota boy said, in perfect English, it isn't a horse at all, it's a mare. And he said after that they laughed and they never again gave him any lessons. And I just think it's a fun story because it really is, you know, and often people, they don't say it, but they probably knew English too at that time, so it's just kind of interesting story. And her story, I think, is probably one of the folders here because basically it's online. You can actually, if you're going to the computer, you go online, you can actually find the story, all the stories. So it's just interesting. Oh, and actually the book, this book, we have, some have it here, right? In there, there's this story and other stories about her is in there, so it's kind of interesting too. And that's for sale from the Shakopee Heritage Society. Okay. Now the next person is Daniel Storer, and he did a diary starting, well, actually before he got here to Shakopee, but he was actually in Shakopee in 1853 until 1905, and he kept a journal all the way. So he has dates, people. Sometimes he write 1 or 2 lines, that's it. But it just gave some really interesting thing. He was born in 1828, moved to Shakopee in 1853. He married his wife. I can't even, how do you say that name? O-M-I-T-T-E-E. Minnie, maybe? Okay. Anyway, they got married. Hopefully he knew the name. And they kept this diary. And he ended up dying in 1905 in Shakopee. He is buried at the cemetery. But if you look at the newspaper back then, you know, he was a carpenter and he would make notes about that. And he built a lot of houses in early Shakopee. And he was also a violin player. And he used to go to all of the different dances and stuff, and he would play the violin. And so that was good because he would document who was going and what was going on. And basically, if you read through it, you're like, these people were like partying left and right all the time. That's my thing. I mean, I'm sure they must have worked. I'm sure they did. But you really look through it, it's a lot. And I think there is an example. Oh yeah, there's the actual what the book looks like, and it's just that information is quite interesting. That book is from the Shakopee Heritage Society. But it's out now. We're out of them. We are going to reprint them. We're in the process of doing that now. But we think because the information there was very interesting, I think. And so yeah, here's the book that you just saw. And again, here's him talking when he first came to Shakopee on August 11th, 1853. He said, "This is the most beautiful little place. There are but few houses here finished off, but a good many are in the course of construction, and all over 20. So there are about 20 houses in process here at that time in 1853. A year ago, they said there was not even one frame house here, so I'm told. But there was a quite large Indian village just below here. In other words, over east of where they were at was Tintotanwa, and there were 600 people there, and they had probably about 55 buildings there. So just interesting. And then here again, he continues on, went out into the timber 3 miles from town to look at a claim today. The country is good and is settling very fast. And this was the time when really a lot of white people were moving into the area. And then on August 14th, he says, went to church in Holmes Hall. They are a good-looking people here. And it's just fun to see. There's little, like, that's the things that he writes, but it makes it fun to look at it now. And again, you go to this cemetery, and there is a statue, what do you call that thing? Tombstone. You know, with that, and that has it there. So.
Where's the cemetery located?
Oh, you know where the old KC, well, still is the KC Hall? 4th Avenue, if you go to 4th Avenue and go east, it'll be on the right, across from what now is My Pillow.
Oh, okay.
Right across the street there. Used to be farm area, but now it's that's how I remember, it's My Pillow now. Okay. So here's another interesting one. Again, she was an early school teacher. Her name's Susan Maria Hazeltine Adams. And she and her husband Andrew settled in Shakopee in 1854. And Andrew was the first county surveyor of Scott County. And she was a school teacher. And she kept a diary in 1856, and she was 29 years old. It's not the most exciting diary, you know, to me, but it's okay. But it's, you know, like if you have to write something, I hate diaries myself, okay? My mother kept diaries, and they're the best thing in the world to look back at. So I know they're really important. I just myself, I hate writing them because I'm the same thing, I can't think of anything to say. They have much better. But anyway, here she talks about, she says, okay, it's April 1st, 1856, beautiful morning. I went to school as usual. Wind rose and rain began to fall at noon, looked dark and threatened a heavy storm. Still, I did not dismiss school until the usual time when it began to sleet, hail, that's hail, I think, and snow, and in the midst of which marched home. A very stormy night. Thought much of my husband and hope he is in some comfortable place. And that's the one thing that's really interesting when you read through a lot of these diaries. The men and the women, they were married often, but one was always away. Maybe that's why they last so long, I don't know. But anyway, it's just kind of interesting. Because that's what's happening here. So here again, she's right, she says, you know, I dreamt about all of the changes that should take place during the coming 2 years. How little I thought my lot would be cast in Minnesota. That I should become the wife of a stranger in such a short time. How different the scenes, what a contrast in my feelings. What's interesting about her is because her husband was the surveyor, he named lakes and things, rivers after him. Lakes, I think. There's Susan Hazeltine has a lake in Carver County named Susan, Lake Susan, named after her. Okay, so it's just interesting. Here's another really interesting one. This is Peter Galeman. I don't know. I'm not very good at remembering saying the names, but anyway, what's interesting here is he wrote letters home to Germany because he was born in Germany, came to America, and wrote back in German, and then it was translated into English. And it tells you so much about people coming over and what it was like. So he was born in Germany in 1825, moved to America in 1851, and located to Shakopee in 1855. Okay. And so here, this is in 1854. And it's just interesting because it tells you the process of how to, he basically said, I want all of you people in Germany to come to America. Come, it's worth it, okay? And he said, I want to let you know a few things, okay? First of all, you should take about 10 to 12 toasted bread, dried fruit, 20 to 40 pounds of white flour, and some sacks of potatoes, some ham, some beans, vinegar, and onions. In other words, he's telling you, this is the stuff you need to bring over from Germany. He said, do not bring many clothes except 1 or 2 pairs of good trousers. Shirts here are cheaper than in Germany. 1 shirt costs 50 cents. Do not bring boots and shoes with you. My sisters being here would change the matter of wearing their hair. Also, take a pot of cooking and a cake mold with you. The other cooking utensils you could buy better in the seaport. Elder downs, which is, the quilts, you should bring with you, but not the other house utensils. The charge for carriage is too high. Many people have left the lurch because they have charged too much for railroad. So he's like letting you know this is the kind of stuff you need to get ready. So it's really a nice summary of that process for all the people who were in, for example, in Europe somewhere and are coming over at the time. And also it's interesting, he talks about the sea towns, and he says, don't go into a hotel for every meal. Don't do it. It's too expensive, basically, okay? And you should always ask the price first. Never pay more than what you have set up. And after you're arriving from New York, you have to provide you tickets. You have to take the best train to Chicago for $5. Or first go to Buffalo for $4, and then go to Chicago. So it's just an interesting process. It's kind of interesting thing. And then what's interesting, he ends up moving to starts with A, in Illinois, and then he moves to Shakopee. And he says this is in 1855. And he said he bought a claim there. The land belonged to the government and was not yet sold. The law says whoever comes first and homesteads, it has a claim to it, but you have to be over 21. So he's really letting you know this is what you have to do. And he says, so I took 160 acres of land, and you have to build a house on it and take care of the land. And whoever is doing that first has the first right to a claim. For this I paid $300. But if I want to sell it, then I have to pay $1.25 per acre, and to announce it 3 months in advance. If you don't pay on time, they can sell it to somebody else, and then you have to leave the homestead. So, and this can take 1 or 2 years. So again, the whole process is really good that he's kind of documenting the process of what happened. And then he said, the other thing that he's kind of said, he said that here in Shakopee, he said, they build houses in the winter. He said people take tree stems and make very nice houses, log houses actually, okay? He said, if you want to build a house, you have to see if you can get all the logs nearby, bring it to a place, cut them into measurements as big as a house is supposed to be. Then you go and call on 8 or 10 neighbors, and then everything will be put together in one day, but the roof. The rest the person has to do by himself, and that can go better than many people imagine. He said, after you've been here for 3 or 4 years in America, you become a pretty good builder, and you acquire all the tools that craftsmen need to build a building. So it's just an interesting process of what happens. But what's really interesting is that he ended up married to Amelia in Shakopee, and they had 6 children. And they operated a general store between 1st and 2nd Avenue and Lewis Street. Okay, so you know Lewis Street, between 1st and 2nd Avenue, in that group there, okay? And it had groceries, dry goods, boots, hats, all that kind of stuff. It was opened in 1857. That store ends up being there for 27 years in downtown Shakopee. But it's also interesting because he also organized the Board of Trade, and he became mayor of Shakopee. He was mayor from Shakopee from 1873 to 1876, and also in 1878. And this was the problem. They decided finally they were going to have a bridge over the river. Because before then, all you had to do was with a ferry. There were 3 ferries in town, okay? But they wanted to do a bridge. Remember that he had a store on Lewis Street. So when they decided, oh, we're going to build this on Fuller Street, he said no. And he's the mayor, okay? So they went back and forth and back and forth. I mean, they were like fights. The newspaper had just article and article where they're complaining because the mayor keeps vetoing everything that they want unless they go on his street, because he figures they'll come over the river and be right there to his store, okay? So after all these meetings and stuff, they finally did build it on Lewis Street. And many people in Shakopee, of course there weren't that many in Shakopee, but they were upset. And they boycotted the store. And became so much that eventually, after 24 years in business, they left Shakopee. And they moved, and they ended up, what's also interesting, they continued with that store, is still around in northern Minnesota, in North Dakota, South Dakota. There's several of them, the stores. So they did very well, but not here in Shakopee. And again, in 1880 was the first time when they actually had the bridge over the river. These are people are celebrating when it was built. And then, of course, that was again on Lewis Street. And then in 1927, they built the Home Street Bridge, okay, which is now still down there, right? And so they had the Lewis Street was still used for foot traffic, but then in 1942, with the war effort, they decided they wanted to take that bridge and use the metal. So they said it was more than 100 tons of metal for bombs, jeeps, and ships. So the Lewis Street Bridge is gone now. Home Street is still there. And then they built another one too, eventually, as you know. But it's just kind of interesting story there.
When they say swing bridge.
Yeah.
Does that mean?
It would come up so that people would, certain steamboats would come through and need to come, and they would open it. So it was like that kind of.
That must be
It was
with
nice.
Henderson too, because one
Yeah.
of our neighbors' fathers used to.
Same kind of thing. It's too bad we don't have that, still, because it was kind of a cool looking bridge and stuff too, but that's the way it comes. All right. Sarah Wakefield, that's her picture. I just want to do this one quickly, but I just want you to know, she and her husband, who was a doctor, moved to Shakopee in 1854. They actually got married, I guess, here in Jordan, but they lived here in Shakopee. And then they moved to the Upper Sioux Agency, and while there, the war between the United States and the Dakota happened, and she was taken captured for 6 weeks in a teepee. And she ended up writing a book. It's still in, you can still buy it. The one on the right is what it looks like. This is what it originally like from, it was built here in Shakopee, or printed in Shakopee. Now I think this is from the University of Oklahoma or something now. What's interesting is that she was one of 100 white women and children who were captured on the Minnesota River. And she spent 6 weeks living among the Dakota. And his thunder, which also was called Chaska, ended up protecting her. And there's this one thing, like in her book, she writes, she said, "People blame me for having sympathy for these creatures, but I take this view of the case. Suppose the same number of whites were living in sight of food, purchased with their own money, and their children dying of starvation. How long do you think they would remain quiet?" And that really is probably what was happening. Now, Chaska, which is, his name is up there, but I'm not going to say it because I can't, unfortunately. Okay, he was pardoned by Abraham Lincoln, but he was still executed. And so then she wrote the book because she wanted to clear her name and Chaska's name, because there was rumors back then that they were having an affair. And she said, no, that's not what happened. He just protected, and his family protected her. And then it's also interesting, just tied into this, is that his wife, then his husband, they moved back to Shakopee afterwards, okay? And then Dr. Wakeman was a drinker, a smoker, and they said he actually, he died with lots of debt. And they believe now that, I believe it actually, when you look at the articles, it looks like he probably, her husband probably committed suicide with opiates in their home in Shakopee. So anyway, it's just interesting that that book, 6 Weeks in the Teepee, is still used today, and there's a lot of discussion about that. You go online and find a lot of interesting things. And here's just another quick one I'm going to say, but just here's Jeanette Decamp Sweet. And again, she actually wrote about her experience, same thing. She was captured, and she wrote it in 1894. She had been married to her husband in Ohio. They moved to Shakopee in 1855. Her next door neighbor was her brother, who married her husband's sister, so you know how that goes, okay. And eventually they moved to the mill, and that's when she got captured. They say she was pregnant, and she had 3 boys that were captured for a month, and then they were brought to safety. And they actually said by his actual, that's his name, but actually is also called Lorenzo Lawrence, actually. Actually, a picture actually shows where they were helping bring them to safety. And that's him, and that's his mother. So, all right, I'm going to just keep moving on here. Now here's another one that when I go on to the computer, and look up writers in Shakopee, this is the one who pops up most often, Eleanor Gates. And she actually lived in Shakopee. And she's the person who wrote A Poor Little Rich Girl, which is kind of somewhat well known. She was born in Eagle Creek Township. You know where that is? Basically, the park, which is like Memorial Park, on down that area. That was all part of Eagle Creek. In fact, if you're on the highway on 169, you go, there's a sign that says Eagle Creek. You know, so that's what you're talking about. It's part of Shakopee. And when she was pretty young, she ended up moving to Dakota Territory. And it's interesting because there's several books that she wrote, but this one specifically, the biography of a prairie girl, which she wrote in 1902, really describes probably her experience growing up here in Shakopee. And so she talks about being like in a farm, and she says, up and down the oxen toiled before the plow, licking their tongues as they went along, for wisps of the sweet new grass which the old board was turning under. After them came the biggest brother, striving with all of his might to keep the beam leveled and the handles from dancing as they still share cut the soil into wide, thick ribbons, damp and black on one side, on the other side, green and decked with flowers. And following the biggest girl trotted the little girl, and that was probably herself, who from time to time left the cool furrow to run ahead and give the steers a lash of the guard she carried, or hopped to one side to keep the stepping with their bare feet upon the fat earthworms that were rolled out onto the sunlight, where they were pounced upon by rivaling blackbirds circling in their rear. And so it's just a great description of what it was like back then. And she ended up being very famous, actually, she wrote about 20 books, several plays. She also, what's interesting, I think also, she she divorced with her first husband. She married a second husband. Then they found out that they really never divorced the first husband. So basically, oops. So she ended up leaving the second husband, being by herself, because they had been in a mess, I guess. All right. There's lots of interesting stories about that. But anyway, Moses Starr Titus is another one who's really interesting. And right the same year that he died, he spoke to the Minnesota Historical Society. And he talked about, he was here before Thomas Holmes came to Shakopee in 1851. He was there before then. He continued to be there after. And he talks about the experience. He's talking about Thomas Holmes and William Quinn coming into the area that later became Shakopee. And said after securing the little craft to a bush, which he brought up the bank of the river to examine the location which he had suited upon, almost by accident, he surveyed the country around him and at once concluded there was a chance. Being an old pioneer, he had some thoughts in advance of most other people, and they determined to make his work. This was at the present site of Shakopee. He pitched his tent and with a few adventures set about building a house. The weather was hot, the mosquitoes were terrible, and the thirsting for his blood. The old long log house, which some of you have seen, and which ought never to have been removed, was erected. Unfortunately, it is gone, okay? It was quite a respectable building to put up, as it was away from every person, place, and thing. Of course, it's not really away from people, place, and things, because remember, the Dakota were living right there, 600 of them. but I'm thinking he's probably thinking of the white people. And this is Moses Starr Titus and his wife, Jane Lamont Titus, who was part Dakota. And then there are 3 of the 4 children there. And it's just interesting. There's a whole nother story about Jane Lamont Titus, who was so smart that she's the one who actually, all the land that everybody wanted and they all fought over, all these men fought over it. She was the smart one. She's the one who got the land. And it's a fun story. Okay. And again, he continues, he talks about the winter, that first winter in 1851. He said he hoped that the town could make a start. And they said they knew that they had to have a store, so they opened a chicken trade with the Indians. He purchased their rat and coon skins, ducks, quilts, not to say feathers, and decorated the papooses with many a string of beads. The foxes and wolves preyed upon his strict sign, and he in turn took their hides. And you can see just how cold it was at that time, and that's really when it started. And Moses ended up being one of the first persons who started a school in the valley in 1852. They built a house in Shakopee, right close to the pond residence. So again, it would be where Memorial Park is, right across the street. Here's what their actual house looked like. It was really quite nice. And again, they were very involved with the Presbyterian Church. And he had lived here in Shakopee for 25 years, and he died in 1878. He was 58 years old. And again, he and his wife, they're both buried at the Valley Cemetery. And finally, I just want to show one more. Here's a more current person, but I just want to make a connection that writers from even back then were really interesting. But she's just interesting because I know her very well because she was in my school. She graduated in 1976. I graduated in 1978. And she has written several books. There's here a couple of books that she's written. All these books, and you just look and you see Antonio Felix. Well, actually, I grew up, her name was, we called her Tony Bird. That was her name back then, okay? But she did graduate from Shakopee High School in 1976. And she said again, the best way to convince, persuade, teach, and inspire is with a story. I think that's a great thing to remember. And she's now moved back from, she was in New York for many years. She and her husband are moved back. They live in Minnesota again now. She's working, I think, getting on a PhD, but she's continuing to write. And I think they did a special thing here in Shakopee because she has written several of these interesting books. All right. So finally, just remember again, this presentation is from the Shakopee Heritage Society, and I think on your thing here on the back is information about the things that are coming up. The next one is Tuesday, July 31st, but then there are several coming up there. Here's more information. The Shakopee Heritage Society is a nonprofit, and it's just a volunteer organization that are trying to preserve the history of Shakopee and passing it on to children and grandchildren. And then finally, on your paper, I don't know if this will work because I don't know if we have the right number. On the back, someone might have a little color star on the top. Maybe pinkish color. Anybody? Maybe not. You got it. Then you get a book. Okay. And again, this book is available, I think it's $17, but if you're a member of the society, you get it for $14, so just so you know. And there are books coming out soon So there will be more, and we'll continue to have them, and each time you come to one of these things, someone will win something. Okay, so have a good day now.